Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Coletta, Senior Manager of Research and Innovation at Phocuswright. I'm really happy to be here today to run this webinar on why trip planning startups stumble, because it has been a long time in the making. I've wanted to do this, and I'm very happy to be joined by Gilad Berenstein, founder of Brook Bay Capital and former founder of trip planning startup Utrip. So how about you, Gilad? You ready to do this?
Oh yeah, this is one of my favorite topics.
A lot of people either love or hate it, I would say, but we're going to do it.
Yeah, I always
Hopefully
like to say
resolve it.
that other than NDC, this is the topic that gets people in our industry the most riled up.
Maybe that's next. But yeah, I mean, over the years on this one, there's been so much debate, tons of debate on whether trip planning startups can be successful in the travel industry and why or why not. So I finally decided I wanted to do something about it, try to put all the debate points in one place in one webinar where I can share my own experience with trip planning startups. And I thought Gilad was a perfect person to bring in to talk about his experience at Utrip, which is a trip planning startup we can all learn a lot from as well. So we've both been there, done that, and we know a lot about the travel startup world and the business of travel. So really for anyone thinking about or actively working in this space, or if you're just a fan of totally spiraling, never-ending debates, I hope this webinar answers a lot of questions, maybe resolves the debate to some degree, although I'm sure it won't fully, but we'll do our best. I admit, I'd say we both have a biased view on this topic. For myself as a researcher, I strive to remain unbiased as much as possible. But admit, anyone could prove, anything we're going to say here wrong eventually. So I remain open-minded and open to debate. But the point today is we're not going to debate. We're going to present our perspective and hopefully encourage people that are actively working in the space or thinking of doing so to move forward with their eyes wide open and an understanding of how hard it's been for startups to build a business here historically and why that is, and even why large companies have struggled in this space. I'm glad we're recording this. We'll post the video to YouTube, and I plan to refer everyone to it who tells me in the future that they're interested in starting a trip planning company. And some of you may have seen that there have been lots of discussions online about this topic recently, especially on LinkedIn. A lot of great points have been made. So thank you to everyone who's been participating in that conversation. Helped me kind of really round out the points I want to make today. We'll try to cover all the nuances and not miss any key points between the two of us. We'll probably miss something, but we'll do our best. The format will be that Gilad and I will both give a quick overview of our backgrounds. And I have some fairly sobering data to share. And then we will go through in some detail the main reasons why trip planners are such a difficult business. And then, of course, we have to talk about artificial intelligence. We will monitor the chat and the Q&A. I think the chat is enabled now. Saw that one question. Okay, so it's open. Feel free to ask questions, leave comments there, and towards the end, we will try to answer any burning questions or address any counterpoints made, either directly in the chat or we'll discuss them. It'll depend on how much time we have left. We have a full hour, but we both have a lot to say on this, so we will try to move as fast as possible. So I wanted to start off by defining what we're talking about when we say trip planning startup, because I'm aware that this phrase doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. So our definition for today is a standalone consumer-facing B2C startup company helping leisure travelers discover trip ideas, map out their itineraries, and or consume content during the planning phase. These are companies that are often aiming to be VC-backed and looking to build a large business. Like this is the one place you need to go to do all your trip planning. We're not talking about standalone companies or tools within companies focused on helping more high-frequency travel customers plan and book more efficiently, specifically, for example, on the B2B side, serving business travelers and travel agents. These are often companies that are, they may be VC-backed, but they sort of know their market limitations. And then we're also not talking about B2C trip planning companies in China or other parts of Asia, because there are some examples of successful trip planning companies there. And I think that's probably due partly to cultural differences. I have heard that there's just even more extreme content fragmentation there among travel content. But I don't fully understand why some of those have been successful when most Western companies have not. So they may be an exception to the rule, and the lessons we're going to talk about here and the examples may be more applicable to Western companies. Right, next, I want to play a video for you that I think you'll find entertaining at the very least, and kudos to Gilad for surfacing it.
If you could plan a trip anywhere in North America, where would you go?
Mount Rushmore.
Well, with Microsoft Expedia Trip Planner 98, you create a trip the exact way you travel.
You still have the route wizard?
Of course. Once you decide where you want to go, you'll get a detailed itinerary and map in less than a minute, including all your stops along the way.
You don't have any suggestions for camping or RV sites, do you?
Only 12,000 of the best from Woodall's directory.
But what about...
Kid Pick?
Oh, yeah.
Highlighting thousands of kid-friendly places, tours, and activities. Expedia Trip Planner 98 has detailed terrain maps for over 75 national parks. And before you leave, you can print out everything you need. With Expedia, you can book a flight, make hotel reservations, and rent a car. You can choose from over 30,000 hotels instantly online. You don't even need a camera. Microsoft is giving away a one-time use Kodak camera in every box of
Microsoft Expedia Trip Planner 98.
Well, I'll just say that other than the free camera, which is, of course, my absolute favorite part of this whole ad, I just find this illustrates the point that I hear most often, which is that whatever the newest technology is that change, is that difference that's going to allow trip planners to succeed. And it's totally possible that Gen AI is somehow different. But I think this makes a really important point that in 1998, they thought they had the killer technology that was going to make this possible.
Yep, quarter of a century ago. And I would say they still haven't nailed trip planning, right? They're still not known for it, but they are still pursuing it, as we'll see. But this gets into why I'm pretty uniquely qualified to talk about this topic, and Gilad as well. But I'll start by going through my background pretty quickly, just for some context. You know, why am I the expert on this? So around the same time that Expedia commercial aired, I was in college. I just got back from studying abroad and had the idea to start iJourney. So it was desktop trip planning software, much like the Expedia software, which I don't even remember if I was aware of at the time, probably not. But I partnered with a software developer. I wrote a business plan. I tried to raise capital. And I might have, I was told, if it had not been for the .com crash right at that time. Because after all, nobody knew it was a bad business idea yet. And so after college, I actually joined Hertz Car Rentals, but I left to join GoTravel.com, excuse me, in 2003, which was, I think, probably one of the first pure online trip planning companies, and I'll tell a little bit more about that. But I also co-founded Europe Up Close, which is essentially a multi-author blog cranking out content similar to Rick Steve. So I ran that for about 10 years. At world.com, they owned incredible domains like USA.com and Europe.com, and I helped turn those into travel sites and monetize them, market them. I started Cheap Trav, which was a metasearch site. This was around the Hipmunk days when metasearch was gaining steam. Learned a lot from that. Spent time at Fodor's Travel Guides, which hopefully most of you know, just helping them try to better monetize their digital content. And as you can see by the green banners, I marked where I had some small exits, but I did not have any huge wins with any of these companies, and that is part of the story. I also ran a meetup group for about 6 years called Travel 2.0 in New York, which was like travel startup therapy. So it was not a pitch session. Travel entrepreneurs would come in and would be honest about their struggles and their pain points, and the group would try to help them. And those were some great sessions. I started Fantrotter, which was like a hybrid of travel planning and metasearch, specifically around events like concerts and sports. The idea being to help people find great travel deals to see their favorite bands and teams on the road. That was a tough one as well. Dream Adventures, I was there for a while. That was a top startup accelerator. I was at Travel Startups Incubator, where I was evaluating companies for incubation and investment. And that brings us currently to Phocuswright, where I'm a research analyst, obviously focused on the travel industry, but also technology and startups. And these are the two main pitch competitions we run at Phocuswright. We have the global startup pitch for younger companies and launch for scale-ups and established companies. So for about 7 years now, I've helped the team field pitches for these, and screen the best companies to put on our stages, interview a ton of companies, go through pitch decks, etc. And over the years, we have literally seen thousands of travel startup pitches, and easily hundreds of them have been for trip planning startups. So we've just seen a ton of them, and we've seen what makes them similar, or in some cases different. The link is there if you want to apply to these or our other programs. We run a lot of different programs for entrepreneurs. If you're applying to these programs, just keep in mind what our verdict will probably be if you're a trip planning company that's not doing anything, we haven't seen before or we consider super unique. So this is a screenshot of GoTravel.com in 2004. It was run out of a mom and pop travel agency, and the owner of the agency bought the domain name. It's a great domain. I helped to join him build out his vision of a site that would help travelers discover and book great vacations somewhat early on in the internet, and we're excited about that. The core of it was kind of that section on the left where you select what you like to do, who you want to travel with, and pick a continent in that case. And we'd recommend trips, which at the time we manually loaded into a CMS from digital brochures. And I would say, to this day, it's kind of what a lot of trip planners remind me of when I say, you're kind of, and it makes sense, you're putting in what's important to you. You try to personalize, the recommendations for people. And it does make sense on the surface. But as you can see, so a lot of my experience was in trip planning because I was totally sold that there had to be a better way, but also spent a lot of time in the broader startup world studying what works and what doesn't. And all of this is to say that I've absolutely been down this road, but Gilad has been down it further than I have, which is why I wanted to bring him in to tell his story. So Gilad, introduce yourself, although we'll save your full story for later.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to be with you, and I've looked through the names. I know many of you, and I'm excited to get to know the rest of you as well. The really high level version of my story, and I'll share more in a little bit, is I grew up in Israel, and my dad was an early artificial intelligence architect back in the 90s and developed an algorithm in 1995 that was really good at high voltage, long distance power transmission. And I'll skip the rest of the story for another time, maybe at a cocktail hour at a Phocuswright event. But I was around AI since the very beginning, and my family moved to the States when I was a teenager. And when I was at the University of Washington here in Seattle, I became a tech entrepreneur and did 2 startups outside of our industry. But right after grad school, I took a trip to Europe, like millions of other people do, and saw all the experiences that made trip planning difficult and challenging for people, and started a company called Utrip back in 2011. It was the first artificial intelligence trip planning company, utilizing all the technologies that were brand new at the time: natural language processing, sentiment analysis, collaborative filtering, all the hottest tools of the 2010s. Started as a B2C company, became a B2B2C company, which I'll talk about more in a sec. And today I'm very engaged in the space as an investor through Brook Bay Capital, my fund. And of course, Kara and I do a podcast together called the Travel Tech Insider.
Perfect. And yes, you'll hear more about Utrip later. So, but you heard a bit about our own anecdotal experiences, but what does the hard data say? So for those who aren't familiar, Phocuswright has been tracking travel startups long before I got here, about 15 years at least at this point. And at this point, we have over 4,600 companies in our travel startup database. We rely on it to write our annual reports on the state of travel startups and the state of funding, and I'm the author of those reports. So this was an offline database that I overhauled when I joined full-time about 7 years ago, and built it into this online interactive database, which is available in our research library for our research subscribers to filter and browse. And I guess the important point is we meticulously categorize companies into travel industry verticals and horizontals. So you can think of it like Crunchbase or PitchBook, where we track funding and headquarter locations and all that kind of information. But you can dig really deep into travel industry trends quite easily through the categorization. And we also have a lot of companies in here that are on our own radar through our pitch applications and whatnot, but wouldn't be even on Crunchbase, et cetera. So here's what the data says about trip planning startups. First, we're looking at vertical categories. This would be travel industry segments. And we track companies all the way back to 2005. And this data is current through Q1 of this year. And these are the failure rates per category, or what percent of companies have closed down. in each, and these are just a selection. We track more categories, but these would be some major verticals. So we clearly see the inspiration vertical has the highest failure rate by far at 49%. This would be companies that help inspire you to travel, give you trip ideas, or find the right destination for a trip that you have in mind. That's followed by destination content at 37%, which would be companies more focused on producing that type of content, blogs and guides, etc. And itinerary at 35% failure rate, which is just what it sounds like, companies that specifically help you build out travel itineraries. So those three categories added up, it's about 700 companies out of the 4,600-ish, and at least 300 of them have closed that we've tracked. And then we track about $205 billion in total funding for all the companies in the database. And between these three categories, companies have raised about $1 billion. Sort of sounds like a lot, but it's really a drop in the bucket of the overall funding number. And even the $1 billion is concentrated among, sort of a small handful of companies. A lot of companies don't raise much, if anything, in this space. And as you go to the right on the chart, you see much more attractive failure rates in more traditional categories like sellers of tours or hotels, car rentals, ground transportation, OTAs, basically the companies that are the transaction or are close to the transaction. And then looking at horizontal categories, this is how we track companies by business model or the primary technology that they are using. And social networking and user-generated content has far and away the highest failure rate at 54%. This would be companies that create communities of travelers, help you find like-minded travelers to travel with, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of overlap between the inspiration and itinerary verticals where, they'll be tagged in one of those and then this on the horizontal side. And again, compared to the categories with low failure rates like expense management at only 3%, payments at 6%, service providers at 7%, even AR and VR, also a tough space, but only 15% failure rate. That 54% is really massive. And I have to say, actually, all these stats aren't even that accurate because it's hard for us to know when companies close. They may leave their website up and sort of be a zombie company. So the failure rates across the board are likely actually significantly higher for most categories.
And I was going to add, Mike, that exact same point. I mean, the failure rates are much, much higher. If you go back one slide, I mean, there's clearly not a success rate of like 60% on some of these things. So I think it's both, tiny little acqui-hires, exits that were exactly. It's just, there's no way that 65% of itinerary companies are successful. So I think what Mike said is exactly right. I think the failure rates are much higher. And especially if we think about it from the type of failure success rates that investors think about, AKA return on invested capital, I would assume that these failure rates are, maybe twice as high. Yeah,
these things play out over time. Company may kind of cease operations, the website stays up for years, and then we finally notice it. So, it takes time to kind of cascade to a more realistic picture. I thought this was a really great example of a company that was on the B2C trip planning path, but made a smart pivot. So on the left is an announcement about the launch of Travify in 2013, a consumer planning startup. That's how they launched. On the right, by 2016, when the founder, David, who maybe is on the webinar, I know you talked to him the other day, Gilad, he presented at my Travel 2.0 meetup group. He had already pivoted to a B2B model using his tools and infrastructure that he built to serve travel professionals, and he's been quite successful there. And this, this is just a pivot that's super common, going from B2C to B2B and finding that B2B, use for the tools. There are dozens of examples out there like this.
Yeah, and if I could just add, this is one of the failure rates. I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but of course, as we all know, customer acquisition is incredibly expensive in our industry. And one of the places companies find success, including Utrip, is pivoting into the B2B or the B2B2C, where they've already figured out the hard part. They already have customers coming to their websites, their applications. And I think this is a great example.
Yep, great point. So what is the problem, or more accurately, what are the multitude of problems? So first, most people actually enjoy trip planning. They enjoy researching the destination and things to do and things to see. It can be fun. It builds excitement, anticipation, get into that mode of discovery, click around, see what's out there, learn. People actually enjoy that. I think the search for hidden gems is particularly addictive. You like to feel like you discovered something unnoticed by others. maybe buried deep in an obscure online message board. Could be anywhere. A successful trip that you plan yourself brings a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. So, if you try to do too much for someone, you actually take that away. And most people like to feel like they got the best prices and are willing to do the research and make comparisons, even to save a few bucks. I mean, I've done it. I think most people do it. Like, oh, I saved $2 on this flight. Somehow that feels good. So there's a sense of satisfaction for that too. Any points on this, Gilad?
Just spot on. I mean, I think that the serendipity is the part that people enjoy. And of course, the optimization of geography is the part that they don't. But in reality, if you think about the last trip you planned, you probably spent very little time optimizing geography. And again, I'm jumping a little forward here, but yeah, the serendipity is something people enjoy, but I think there's a lot of things about it they really don't.
I like that phrase, optimization of geography.
Yeah.
Kind of captures it. So this is an old slides from 2018, but it's still very relevant today. We have a selection of trip planning companies that didn't make it on the left side, operating at what we refer to as the top of the booking funnel. In that inspiration phase, as you kind of do your research and then you narrow things down to booking and then eventually traveling. I put the famous line from an Expedia study there that travelers visit 38 sites before booking, and citing that as a problem that needs to be solved. But on the right is Phocuswright's own research showing that when we used to ask travelers in our consumer surveys, is planning travel online frustrating? 60% disagreed with that. So you have some neutrality in there, but only a little over 20% actually agreed. So this shows pretty clearly that your average traveler is not frustrated with the online planning process. And we stopped asking this question, but I actually want to bring it back just to see if it's changed. I really doubt it has.
Yeah, no, in my conversation with Rich Barton about this, Rich Barton, of course, is the founder of Expedia and many other successful startups as well. He always talked about the distance between the inspiration and the booking, and that even if one builds a successful, a great trip discovery, trip planning, top of funnel solution, that typically the transaction is so far away. And of course, trip planning is not linear, and you don't sit down in one sitting and just do the whole thing, that he always felt like it was so far away from a transaction that it did not make sense for an OTA business to do this. And of course, we all know that OTA businesses make a lot more money than trip planning businesses. So he clearly had some insight there.
Yeah, we'll talk more about that specifically. Thought it'd be fun to include a screenshot of that original Expedia study from 2013, as we have seen it cited in countless startup pitches. So that's what does not make you unique. Sorry?
I've used it hundreds of times in investor pitches.
That's a better use in a pitch.
Yeah.
Than for startup. So next problem, most leisure travelers travel infrequently. The average leisure traveler takes a trip or two a year, and you have to reach them at the right time when they're in planning mode to make them aware of your solution. And that's just really hard. They may have even seen your company at some point, but when they actually try to plan a trip or they're ready to plan a trip, they don't remember you. Most people are very price sensitive. So they want to shop around and they're just not loyal to brands or tools. Again, referring to the kind of infrequent leisure traveler. And so the bottom line with that is it's just very hard to get repeat usage that translates into any kind of significant revenue.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that even the largest companies in our industries, even the OTAs, do not count on repeat usage without reacquisition cost. If you look at the business model of Booking or Expedia or any of the big guys who actually sell travel, they assume that they're going to have to reacquire the customer every time because of this infrequency. So imagine having a brand that is tiny in its presence in comparison to the big guys, and imagine what your reacquisition cost might be.
Great insight on how they think about it. Next problem, everyone plans differently. So from dumping ideas into a Google Doc or a spreadsheet to using the huge variety of existing online tools. Like I said, we're tracking at least 700 companies in these categories over the years. People use online tools like Trello, I've heard of that, to organize an itinerary or any kind of information. Some people just use browser bookmarks, create a folder. Some people use pen and paper, right? The process that different people are comfortable with varies tremendously. And so I think this boils down to an interface problem. Developers and UX UI people get proud of the UI they built, saying maybe this is sort of cracking the code as to how to enable people to plan in the best way possible, but you just can't jam everyone through the same interface who has very different styles of using and even understanding digital tools. You basically have to train people to use your interface, and you lose a lot of people right there.
Yeah, it's even,
go ahead.
sorry, I was gonna say it's even more complicated than that, because even within a given user, based on the trip you go on, their type of planning experience they want is different. So we'll show some screenshots of Utrip a little later, but the first iteration of Utrip was focused on people going to Europe. And that had one experience for certain types of users who went to Europe. But even if those same users went to go spend a weekend in LA or San Francisco, they were planning differently enough that interface for Europe was really not ideal for them. So you both have the differences between people, but also between types of trips that a given person takes.
Yeah, complexity of the itinerary, type of information that needs to be kept track of, and then how someone likes to keep track of those ideas and cross them off, or bubble them up, prioritize them. Some people like lists, some people like maps. So it's almost impossible to build an interface that works for a very large number of people. Travel content is super fragmented. Everyone and their mother produces static travel content, social posts, photos, videos, blogs, articles, news lists, newspapers, magazines. So it's very difficult for any company to capture all of this and surface the very best of it, especially in any sort of really personalized way to the end user. And then you have dynamic travel content, meaning live prices and availability. It's expensive to access. It's incredibly different to get right. Most people don't know there's trillions of combinations of, for a flight search of possible routes and airlines and amenities and seats and times. And what if someone's planning an international trip and then the flight they're looking at sells out and they get priced out of taking that trip altogether, and they don't even know that. So that might be kind of a rare example, but you get the point. To assemble all the information from static and dynamic travel content sources is very difficult, and any of it can go out of date at any time. There's simple trips and complicated trips, which you were starting to talk about. So a trip planner might be fine for a weekend in the city, but you could also just look at a top 10 blog post and go on your way. For a more complicated trip, like a week or two or a month in an exotic location, you start to really need specialized knowledge and information to give the user. And then as you try to serve a broader audience, it gets harder and harder to have all the information people need in one place. You start running into major knowledge and information gaps. People get disappointed that you don't have what you're looking for and abandon you and go back to their spreadsheet or whatever, where they can just track what they need. So it's really hard to break out of being niche, I think is a very important point, while keeping everyone happy and thus building a big business. So, there are some examples of people building, trip planning businesses in niches that have specialized information that are plenty large enough for them. They're just not like VC worthy or destined to become sort of a major brand.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that last point that Mike made is critical. Of course, a lot of what we're talking about is from the perspective of companies trying to become big, like we defined at the beginning of the presentation. There's a real opportunity right now using Gen AI and other technology to build incredible small and medium businesses in the space that will actually be more beneficial to travelers because of the unique content, because of the unique inventory they might offer. So imagine OTA focused on skiing in Asia or hiking in the Pacific Northwest or things like that. It might be a great experience for consumers and a great business for you as a founder and for your team. It's just not the type of venture scale business that venture investors are looking for. But of course, venture is just one tiny part of the landscape of successful businesses.
Maybe that's something you and I can debate a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I kind of see both sides of that. But next problem, travel marketing is expensive. Really building any consumer brand is only getting more cost prohibitive over time. SEO is going away, you could say, in some ways due to generative AI. There's just not a lot of great free marketing opportunities, even social, so saturated. So some stats on this, according to Statista, in 2023, the top 11 publicly listed online travel players alone spent $8.4 billion in Google Ads, 19% more than 2022. and forecasted growth of another 10% in 2024. So it's just really hard to break through, and it's expensive to attract any kind of large audience. There's only so far I think you can go on organic growth, unless your product is super duper unique. And that's especially true when it's very hard to monetize. You're at the top of the booking funnel. Again, you're far from the transaction. It's hard to convert users to a transaction, get them to book something. And then it's especially hard to get bookings through affiliate links, which is the easiest route, but you're just not price competitive in that case, and people are going to go shop around and probably not book through you. It's hard to build a big enough audience to advertise against meaningfully, because as we just went through, it's kind of hard to break out of being niche and remain relevant. And it's hard to get people to pay for your tool. People expect this kind of thing to be free. And then once you get deep enough into transactions, if you're negotiating flight and hotel and other product rates, and you're blocking inventory and you're packaging things, or you're creating tours, is your core business really being a planner anymore? No, I'd argue not. Thoughts on any of that, Gilad?
I'm totally aligned. That's spot on.
All right, well, that brings us to perhaps the biggest problem of all, which is increasingly you are up against the big guys, and maybe even now the generic AI, LLM tools. So this includes Expedia, once again, TripAdvisor, Google, many others that are targeting travel and planning and booking with renewed zeal, using AI. Even OpenAI has used travel examples for ChatGPT. This is the latest example from Expedia on the screen. This is the new AI planning tool that they launched this past fall. You have TripAdvisor. Obviously, they have a ton of great content, and they rolled out their AI tool last year at some point. If you go to use Microsoft Copilot, you got Vacation Planner right on the right side there. So they're obviously, prioritizing that and trying to drive people there. And maybe the most important to talk about is Google, which we talk about and have for a long time in the travel industry, both kind of everything that they provide to travel and the things they do great, but also sort of the competitive threats that they pose. So just a month ago, Google announced AI for building itineraries. That's the headline on the left. And then on the right is I was logged into Gemini Advanced, where you could say I put an @ symbol there, and so now you're able to call your Gmail, your Google Docs, other Drive files, and then even Google Flights and Google Hotels, Google Maps, and YouTube. All the things that a lot of people use, anyway. So now you can kind of just access that all in here, have a conversation about it, and get live prices and get tons of information and pull it right in. So, to me, Google already has most of the world's information that's accessible on the internet already in their index. They have the native integration with major travel products for real-time prices, with probably tours coming and maybe car rentals, etc. eventually. There's everything they know about people that can be used for personalization, which, I'd say they haven't really tapped all that much. I kind of assume they move slowly, not to cross the creepy line too much with personalization or go afoul of regulators, but they have the potential to personalize as well as anyone. So this to me just looks like a really formidable product for travel planning.
Yeah, if I could just add here, I mean, I completely agree with everything Mike just said. I mean, and the one thing I would also add is the fact that one of the challenges trip planners always have is connectivity, right? You need to build a connectivity to your calendar, to a map, to an Uber, to whatever it is you need to do to execute the trip. A concept some of us refer to as the connected trip. Well, Google has a connectivity pre-built. And this is why I really think this could be a killer new product, because it seamlessly, and I encourage you to play with it, will go into your email, into your calendar, into your maps. And that connectivity is a huge advantage they have over any type of startup doing this in the space.
I see people pointing out they've also shut down products, doesn't always work. So, right, always a possibility.
And the question they have on the business model is a difficult one, right? They have the classic innovator's dilemma. They're running one of the largest ad businesses in the world. And as Mike pointed out, our industry is one of the biggest spender on Google ads in the world. So there's clearly a challenge they have on the business model of trying to figure out how to balance their billions of dollars of revenue from advertising and travel with these travel products. So I will say that even if they don't go into booking, even though Google Flights is shutting down, does not mean they're not going to be a formidable competitor in the planning phase of trips.
Yeah, good point. And I thought we should talk a little bit more about AI specifically. So, do we see it as being a real game changer? I'll start with some research. So last summer, in a survey, Phocuswright asked travelers in the US and Europe various questions about their familiarity with and use of generative AI for travel. So this first chart actually shows just general familiarity with it. So meaning they've at least heard of generative AI, and then active usage on the blue line, meaning they have tried or used tools like ChatGPT or DALL-E. So the highest familiarity with, as well as usage of generative AI, was in the US. Just about 80% of travelers had at least heard of it, and 22% had tried or used it. And then lowest familiarity in the UK at 67%, but lowest usage in France and Germany at 13%. The UK and Italy also right there at 14% each. But among those who said they were familiar with it, those who said they'd be extremely or at least somewhat comfortable using it to plan a trip, it varies between countries. It's highest in the US at 50%, lower in Canada at 41%, and then lowest in France and Germany at 30 and 35% respectively. So this does represent pretty strong interest in some of these markets. So I think we can say there is opportunity here. But then starting with the weaknesses of AI for trip planning, hallucinations is a really big one, I guess we should be more specific that we're talking about generative AI here, not AI as a whole. But generative AI has the tendency to just make things up, and that can include transportation options and hours of a restaurant or other important information. Again, things that Google has good information on in their POIs, but the LLMs themselves, just aren't great at this. It can be solved by travel companies with techniques like retrieval augmented generation. That's something to look into if you're building a solution like this. But also LLMs currently have poor logic, so they can just make bad suggestions or say bad itinerary, route planning type of suggestions. The screenshot on the right there is from a recent report that found that 90% of AI-generated travel itineraries had inaccuracies. So, it's a big problem if it's not executed correctly. It's these LLMs are limited to the available data, so you kind of never know what gems could be missing from a data set when you're chatting with them, depending on how it's built. And then they suffer from generality. So they just sort of have a tendency to provide generic recommendations and favor popular places unless they're tweaked further.
Yeah, I have two more thoughts to the weaknesses of AI in addition to these. First is defensibility. The idea that most of us in the world are using 3 or 4 large foundational models to further train what we are doing within our own startup leads the technology and data moat to be much smaller than in past technology epochs. So thinking about how much manipulation you did or someone else is doing to a GPT API does not seem defensible because someone else has the ability to do the same type of training with additional content as well. The second piece I think is really important is that Gen AI is not able to do one-to-one personalization. It cannot go beyond what is in the prompt. It can just do generic personalization based on what's in the prompt. And there's no way in a trip planning exercise to put everything you need into a prompt. Think about basic things like how you want to deconflict flight schedules, or what your favorite seat is on an airplane, or different things you might want to have in your hotel room and picking between hotel types. These are things that are just not simple to put into a GPT chat type of box, no matter how many lines and how much typing you ask your customer to do, which is why ultimately I think that AI is a tool used by people to accomplish their goals. That's a line from a different webinar, I guess. But the point there being is that the AI is just one element of the trip planner. And when people talk about AI being able to solve the whole thing, I just think they have not spent enough time thinking about the complexities and intricacies of planning a really great big trip.
I think that depends on how it's implemented in the background. Like you can pass someone's personal information sort of, if you're using an LLM API. But we do need to keep moving because we're at 40 minutes in already. We still have a bunch of stuff to cover. So the strengths of AI for trip planning, the way I see it, planning is an unstructured process, and that's conducive to natural language chat type of environment where you can go back and forth and you can shape things. So you avoid that interface problem to some degree. Might have other issues with that interface, but at least it's sort of unstructured, which is a match. It's good at summarization and distillation of massive quantities of information. AI interfaces are currently mostly limited to text, but will continue to improve as multimodal and visual content is integrated. Travel is very visual, so that's much needed. And there was a good Google demo of this if people want to go look up the Vertex presentation from a couple weeks ago. They demoed seat selection right in the chat. And then it has great potential for personalization. Again, depending on the way it's integrated, like Google should be able to take a lot of things it knows about you and personalize its LLM results accordingly. I don't know if we should debate that. I don't think we have time, but maybe there are some limitations there. The two-way conversation is still kind of a potential right now. It's more of a one-way where you are just asking questions and prompting, but at some point, it will get to the point where the AI is asking you questions and learning. And then real-time communication too, meaning you can interact with it anytime. So even when you're on the ground in a destination, you can sort of still be continuing your planning in real time. And then some AI considerations. One we could debate is whether it favors big companies, right, Gilad, if they have the data.
If they have the data and the money, and we're all licensing the same API from OpenAI, there's a reason to believe that OpenAI will give the people with more money better access, faster access, the latest tools. So I think both money and data to further training clearly shows that at least part of this era is a pro-incumbent era, which I don't love, but seems to me to be factually true.
Subject to regulation. So we have to see what happens with lawsuits like the New York Times and how much LLMs will be able to continue to use public content. And then similar thought, subject to the publisher aggregator dynamic. I think about what if publishers of content kind of learn the lessons of the past and say, we're not going to give these aggregators access to our content, and then have them gain all this power from it and sort of disintermediate us.
Well, and Mike, I saw someone in the chat actually talk about this. Someone asked, like, what can we all do together to fight back against the big guys? And creating data moats is one of the things. Now, again, as we think about competitive dynamics within the group, I'm not sure if they would ever actually come to fruition and happen, but we as an industry could absolutely take content that we have that's proprietary, train our own models, and make it only available to members of that co-op. Again, I'm not sure if that's realistically going to happen, but it's certainly something that could happen to fight back against them.
Then you have to figure out how to market it, that much more if you're sort of not discoverable by the models or in search. But yeah, it's a deeper conversation. And just that things will improve a lot over time, right? We're still at the beginning, but particularly in logic and reasoning, GPT-5 should be a big advancement this summer, and Google's model, all of them, are only going to get better at reducing hallucinations and better at things like logic.
Yeah, and I have heard people from OpenAI say that they believe that things like geographic optimization, which is something GPT-4 cannot do, right? Even if it makes great recommendations for you, it cannot put them in a logical geographic order. They claim that GPT-5 will have capabilities that can take geography, seasonality, and other things into account that are clearly important in planning a great trip.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. I thought this was a good, notable example. Some of you probably remember this. Wayblazer had Terry Jones on board. He was famous for his work at Sabre and founding Travelocity and being on an executive with Kayak. But, even they couldn't make this work with AI. Started as B2C, went to B2B model, used the best AI at the time. This was pre-generative AI. So would that make a difference now? Who knows? I kind of suspect not. But, there's a lot to learn. I think Terry wrote about this too and what he learned from it. And there are a lot of other postmortems out there that are worth looking up. And then last thing on AI, just have to touch on autonomous agents. The idea is that they'll be able to do a lot of things for us, make decisions, go out, gather information, and actually do things, not just provide information. And that would include planning and booking travel. This is an article about how OpenAI is working on them. And I highlighted there in the article, there's so many of these where people just can't help themselves to give a travel example. Oh, it could book your, your great itineraries or book your flights for you. So, a lot of people are sort of looking at travel as a use case for these agents. Hopefully it does take care of the tedious parts, like just really making sure we got the best prices, and just, I guess, securing the booking. But we'll have to see what these really mean in the somewhat near future. And then, Gilad, I wanted to give you the floor. We've gone through the data, the problems, the potential of AI, but your story at Utrip is a great one, should tie a lot of this together, including AI. So please do walk us through your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I shared the very beginning with you guys already. Grew up in Israel, was exposed to artificial intelligence as quite a young kid in the back of the living room with my dad and all of his fancy AI friends. Moved to the States in the 90s when my dad joined a startup. And then after doing a couple startups in undergrad, I took a trip to Europe and had all sorts of thoughts about how trip planning could be made easy, enjoyable, and personal. I can't see your faces, and I'm sure many of you are smiling because you've heard these words before. And had all these little hurdles that we faced along the trip. We talked about the example that in Barcelona, I wanted to see a soccer game at Camp Nou, but there was a buy that week. And I didn't look at all the combinations of all the things where I could have gone to Paris the week before, Barcelona the week after, and made the soccer game at Camp Nou, but I missed that data point. I missed that content, and I was bummed I did not get to see the soccer game at Camp Nou. Or example, I was in Paris where I was a budget traveler. I found a great budget hotel, but I'd never been to Paris before. So I didn't realize that it was not near one of the main subway stations and would take me quite a lot of time to get in and out of the city center each day. And it was a huge bummer that I couldn't find a hotel that was really optimized around the things I wanted to do. And then, of course, a positive example I like to share from that trip, I was in Venice and met this random chef and had this totally incredible experience where he took me to these hole-in-the-wall restaurants that were incredible. And I remember thinking, how do I get this guy's recommendation on where I get to go in Rome, as opposed to some generic recommendation on TripAdvisor from people who've probably only been to Rome 1 or 2 times in their lives. And I took all these experiences and I came back and I quit my job and I started Utrip. And as I shared, Utrip began trying to become TripAdvisor 2.0. I thought then, as I still think now, the TripAdvisor's lack of personalization is a real missed opportunity and leaves a large opening for many of us in the startup world to create products that are much more personalized and much smarter in how people plan trips. And we spent about 1.5 years building the direct-to-consumer Utrip experience, trying to become TripAdvisor, had about 450,000 users who used it during those 2 years, which of course in OTA trip planning terms is a very small number of users. And what we learned is that we were pretty good at product and pretty good at data and recommendations, but really we're not good at driving traffic for many of the reasons that Mike highlighted earlier in frequency, distance from a transaction, et cetera. So we pivoted. We actually listened, and we had the Australian Tourism Ministry come to us and ask if they could license it. And we said, tell us more. What would you want to do with it? And a couple months later, the city of Dallas offered us $37,000 to license our software for a company that had made like a couple $100 the year before. And we're like, heck yeah, we're a B2B2C company now, and pivoted the business. And that's really where Utrip found success. Now, before I go forward, I want to tell you what I'm seeing on the screen right now. I got too excited and jumped a little bit too far ahead in the story. When we started Utrip, before we built our beta, we spent 6 months working with psychology professors at the University of Washington who studied consumer decision-making, and we looked at it from the perspective of trip planning. And what we identified was that trip planning was a 6-stage circle. And I assume today this looks familiar to many of you, but in 2011, 2012, no one was talking about trip planning as a circle. People were all talking about it as a funnel. And of course, the circle it begins with discovery, then, which is a kind of dreaming and imagining, going to research, planning, purchasing, managing. Of course, we all know that purchasing is non-linear. So you might purchase a flight and a hotel and do a lot more planning and discovery before you go and purchase an activity or a dinner reservation. Then you go to manage or execute your trip, and then you share your experience with family and friends. And of course, your sharing of your trip to Rome becomes my perfect discovery for my trip to Rome. If you can go to the next slide, please. And the other thing that we found out from the psychology research is we try to understand what led to a good travel experience and what led to a bad travel experience as we're trying to train these algorithms to help people plan trips. And what we found was that the best cause of a good trip was authentic experiences. And authentic experiences had two elements to it. It was both authenticity to oneself and doing things that are true to you and who you are, but it was also authenticity to the destination you're visiting and doing something that's authentic in that place. And when you flip that and ask what leads to the worst trip of someone's life, almost always misinformation or the feeling of a wasted experience, which are really kind of the same thing, waste and inefficiency, was the leading cause when people described bad trips that they had before. Next slide, please. And ultimately, these are old stats now, but the point I was trying to illustrate here is that for a very long time, people and companies have believed that personalization matters. And of course, I still believe that personalization matters. And this is why I think this is an important conversation to be here, and why, as Mike said, nothing we're doing here is intended to stop you or dissuade you from pursuing your dreams. The goal, of course, is to share what we have learned, both the successes and failures we've had, to help you do this with your eyes wide open. Next slide, please. Now, Utrip had three major iterations, product, consumer-facing elements throughout its history. The first was really targeted on people going to Europe. So this was on complex, multi-day, multi-city trips where the optimization problem was really the most painful. The second was kind of in the middle, and the third one was really more of a smart list maker with ideas and recommendations that then relied on a mobile application in order to help you execute your trip on the ground. And what we found is that each version not only had more users, which maybe is a bad metric because the company kept growing, but the usage was deeper, the NPS was higher, the repeat usage rates were higher as we took away features, took away capabilities, and really focused on creating a great list and then allowing you to execute it on the ground. As I referenced, we pivoted, if you go to the next slide, as I referenced, we pivoted from B2C to B2B2C in order to really find our growth. And we began by licensing these capabilities to DMOs, destination marketing organizations, and convention visitors bureaus. And from there, we licensed to hotels, and then airlines, then cruise lines, then points of interest and OTAs and other types of companies. And what you see here was the way that we collected data about customer preferences. This is, of course, almost a decade before the Gen AI revolution. And we use these levers. And what we did here is, using the psychology, is we tried to understand how these things come together to really get a deep picture of a customer preferences. And this is the same effort you have to do today. You really have to think about how do you use all the information you have to get much deeper into a traveler's preferences. So the way that I knew if you like nature, if you wanted to go bungee jumping, or if you wanted to go on a leisurely forest walk, was a combination of your spontaneity, adventure, and nature preference. And together, this allowed us to have over 800 billion possible inputs that our travelers could put in for us to understand. Next slide, please. This is, again, an example. We had feature trips, so the term creator and influencer did not exist in 2012, 2013. We had local experts. And what we did, and this is a way that I think makes a lot of sense still today, and to take creators and influencers, is we allowed them to pre-create an itinerary and then use the artificial intelligence to personalize it further. So you could take an itinerary put together by a Michelin star chef in San Francisco, but say, actually, my budget's a little bit lower, or also I really love sports. And I think the combination of AI and curation was something I believed in a decade ago, and something I still believe is a real opportunity today. Next slide, please. And this is just one example of what it looked like. This is version 2 of the app. What it looked like on an integrated website. This is a simple white label under the Visit Spokane domain, my hometown where I moved when I moved from Israel. And this is what it shows, what it looks like. Now, to finish, a couple thoughts here. The value proposition that we offered our B2B customers was 4-pronged. First was increased engagement with their brand. And of course, the belief that increased engagement leads to increased loyalty. So the idea was, by having recommendations, by having trip planning on their websites, customers would engage more deeply and come back more frequently without having to be reacquired. Second was increased conversion on core inventory being a hotel reservation if you're a hotel, or a flight if you're a flight. And then increased conversion on ancillary revenue. This is where the financial ROI, kind of the most financial ROI, actually came in. The ability to sell tours, attractions, and activities was what Utrip was focused on. But of course, there's many other ancillaries that we see, and we've seen a lot of small trip planners succeed by selling these things. Again, small successes. but succeeded by selling these things. And the fourth thing we did is we helped our partners collect data about their traveler preferences. This was something that in 2012, 13, 14 was very hard to do. But the reality is it's getting hard to do again. As we all know, GDPR and CCPA make it harder to collect third-party data. As we all know, Google is killing the cookie, so collecting first-party data is going to become harder. So here again, a value prop that sort of went away over the last 7 or 8 years of helping your large enterprise clients collect data may be coming back if you can figure out both a technically and legal way to go about doing that. So these are a few of the examples from Utrip. Now, I just want to highlight a couple of the challenges we faced, and I think we've highlighted most of them, so I'm going to go through it very quickly, since we're also, this is the data I was talking about, sharing this kind of aggregated data with our partners. So a few mistakes we made and a few challenges we faced. First is purpose-built tools. For some reason, and I can't tell you exactly why, most travelers do not use purpose-built tools when they're planning a trip. We use purpose-built tools for booking, but the number one trip planning tools are the Google tools that Mike highlighted earlier: Google Maps, Google Calendar, Google Sheets. So that's something that we found that we always believed that people wanted purpose-built tools, but for some reason that has not been something that's been proved at any sort of large scale yet in trip planning. Second thing I'd say is that focus groups in travel are really bad. Most people don't say, when you ask people in a focus group how they want to plan a trip, they come up with these really smart, elaborate ways to plan a trip. When you watch the way people actually plan trips are planned in the in-between times. Literally between meetings, on the bus, on the toilet is when people plan trips. And it's non-linear, which makes it a lot harder to get people to plan trips in one go in this elegant way, and to do the things they told you in a focus group they might want to do. People want multiple sources, and Utrip was all about multi-sources. We had the Zag and the New York Times and Yelp and Google Places. But what we found is when you combine multiple sources through one curation layer, which was the Utrip algorithm, people saw it as a single source. Even though we talked about all the sources that we had in there, that was one challenge that trip planners have, is people want verification from friends, from publications, from curators, and the single source has been a challenge. People plan in too many different ways. I won't go any further since we spent a fair amount of time on that at the beginning. And the last thing I added there, which I saw some nice pushback in the chat, is that it's really hard to collect enough data to have hyper-personalization. Hyper-personalization is not just about picking the right restaurant, which is hard enough. Hyper-personalization is also about figuring out what time I like to have dinner, what seat I like to have on the flight, where I want to have my layover. And to get that level of information into a trip planner to create the proverbial perfect trip is a much harder undertaking than it seems. So these are some of the challenges we ran into on the product side. And then very quickly, the business model challenges that trip planners seem to always have. One is they're too far away from a transaction. So even if you help someone plan a trip, they often don't book with you. So it's hard for you to generate the kind of revenues that inferior products like OTAs are able to generate. And thus it's hard for you to be able to afford to acquire the customers, which is the second business challenge. The cost of customer acquisition is often too high and can only be paid for with selling travel inventory, not through ads or things like that. Third is ROI measurement is difficult. When you're a B2B trip planner, it's very hard for you to say, is this conversion because of my trip planning capability, or was this a person who was already going to convert anyways, and that's why they pre-selected to use these trip planning technologies, trip planning products, and thus your trip planner really provided no ROI or very limited ROI. And of course, as trip planner creators, we disagree with that pushback, but it is legitimate pushback for your suppliers to ask, did you really lead to the conversion, or was it going to convert anyways? And then the last business model problem, of course, is affiliate models are too small. No big business can be built on a cut of a cut of a cut, which is what most of these trip planners are getting. So these are some of the challenges, but as I said before, the goal is definitely not to dissuade you, but to help you be armed with as much information as possible.
Well, on that note, should you do it? I mean, yeah, you can try. Like we are saying, there's always a chance someone will sort of, crack the code and prove us wrong. So I guess we're telling you there's a chance, even if it's only 1 out of a million. yeah, our goal is just to point out how hard it's been, and likely increasingly hard it will be or could be to succeed here, as a result of generative AI now in the mix. Want to give one other example here. This one's super interesting to me because Dietz is a new trip planning startup launched by Paul English, who many of you probably know is the founding CTO of Kayak. And Dietz is totally focused on letting people create guides, plan their trips with or without AI, and it's got a social networking element to it. So number one, Paul, if you're watching, I would love to know what you thought of the rest of this webinar. And number two, for everyone else, this is also who you're up against in the trip planning space. So something else to keep in mind.
And if I could just make one last point, as I know everyone's rushing off to their next meeting, venture is not the only path. There are so many amazing travel businesses in our industry that began as a small business, and some of them became a medium business, and a few of them became a big business. So just because the venture path may not be right for your business does not mean there's not a great opportunity for you to pursue.
Yeah, I've touched on that too, right? Lifestyle businesses, there's nothing wrong with that. Could be better, a lot of people would say.
Especially in a fun industry like travel where the lifestyle perks are pretty great.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know we're over time, but I think we're okay to stay a few more minutes. So brings us to our conclusion. Again, someone could prove any of this wrong. Maybe it'll be Paul English. Maybe it'll be one of you watching right now. Maybe it'll be Google. But even with them, for me, it's hard to imagine anyone owning this space. It's so fragmented. You have so many things that just make people go in different directions. Yeah, if you're thinking of doing this or you're actively working on it, our bottom line is our goal is to basically beg you just to please go into it with your eyes wide open. Hopefully this webinar helped a lot as to, all the things you need to be thinking about, understanding all the challenges and learning from past mistakes. Again, there's a lot of postmortems and people who have written a ton about this that are out there if you go look. And then to be aware of where things are going. The tech giants remain formidable, especially in the age of AI. And I think you have to think a lot about how the interactive planning experience will even change beyond the chat environments and even for future generations, depending on how far out you want to go and how far out you want to think. But something like the Apple Vision Pro, a lot of people going to be using these devices. Like VR has taken a long time to catch on. AR too, it's like slow adoption, but eventually, we're all sort of being pushed in that direction to use these things, and they're getting better and better. So if you can have more of an interactive experience, a visualization of experience, and then if you can have a discussion, that's what I envision. You'll have kind of a virtual AI travel agent avatar that you can have more of a real voice, natural conversation with, and maybe be in your Apple Vision Pro and having that conversation visually, and you don't have to be typing things. Maybe that's the future of trip planning. So if anyone might own this space eventually, I think it would probably be a tech giant that kind of offers an AI assistant that does everything well in your daily life and you rely on for most things, right? You're just asking and it's doing things, and you can ask them to help you plan your trip the way you would anything else. But I acknowledge that future scenario where specialized information will remain necessary. And again, no one will own the space, which will leave opportunity for smaller companies who do specific things really well. So I think that's where the opportunity remains. I had some recommended reading. There are lots of articles on this topic. As I mentioned, lots of debates on LinkedIn, especially recently. I encourage you to go search them out. But wanted to highlight this article. It set up one of the better counterpoints that's been made. So this is an article written in January of 2016 on T-News at the time, which became our Phocuswire news site. It was written by Nadav Gur, who is a travel entrepreneur, and he laid out a lot of the points that I've gone over today about why you should never consider a travel planning startup. But I wanted to mention, this was the counterpoint to that article published a few weeks later by Saket Newaskar, co-founder and CTO at TripHobo. And they wrote a two-part viewpoint offering the opposing view to Nadav's article. And TripHobo is still around today, still doing trip planning. So if you're going to listen to a counterpoint from anyone, this is one where the company proved that they can stick around. So that's worth reading. And then one more, this is the kind of the 2024 version of Nadav's article, written just a few weeks ago by Christian Watts of Magpie Travel. Also echoes a lot of the points that Gilad and I made here today. I wanted to mention the travel startup database, where some of these stats and the data that I showed came from. So this database was historically only available to Phocuswright subscribers, but we recently made standalone access available. So whether you're a startup or an investor or an executive, if you want to research and understand the competitive landscape in the trip planning space or elsewhere in the travel industry, this is truly the best way to do it. And we tried to price it pretty reasonably at $4.95 a year for access. It is updated really daily. So the stuff that you see online, it all goes in here, gets categorized, and you can filter it and look at trends. So yeah, we tried to make that pretty affordable. Wanted to plug our travel innovation and technology trends reports. I think is very relevant for this audience. And this is one of the main areas of content that I manage at Phocuswright. I personally work hard to make these the most insightful reports on the most important trends in travel and tech. And for 2024, we covered 6 trends: underappreciated tech and travel, digital identity, sustainability. We have 2 reports on generative AI on kind of the short and the long-term views, and CBDCs. You can buy the bundle of all the reports for $14.95 or buy individual reports for $2.95 each. And I did a short webinar that kind of summarized the trends a month or 2 ago, which is on YouTube if you want to go look that up. All of this research is part of our open access library. So if you're a subscriber, you get all of our startup and tech innovation research, as well as our market sizing, our consumer trends, and other reports that keep our clients ahead of the curve in travel. Be great if you join us in Phocuswright at Phocuswright Europe in Barcelona in June. Prices go up as it gets closer, so the sooner the better to get your ticket. At Phocuswright Europe, I'll be presenting on startup trends and also running 2 panel discussions. So one with Europe-based investors and one on AI, actually with Christian Watts. I don't know if someone's jumping my slides here, where we're going to debate man versus machine. So that'll be a great AI debate. We've got Phocuswright conference in Phoenix in November. Don't forget to visit Phocuswire for all your travel, tech, and distribution news. And that gets us to our thank you and good luck. It looks like Gilad had to jump. I was going to say we could try to take a couple of questions, but we are pretty over time. I saw there was a question for Utrip. I saw there was a point about Google Flights shutting down, which I forgot about. I do need to look into that. I mean, it's available in Gemini, so I'm actually not sure of the status there. But I think we do have to cut off. So I hope this shed a lot of light on the subject, helps travel entrepreneurs make better decisions about where to focus their time and energy going forward, because travel is a very difficult industry to succeed in as a startup. Either way, trip planning is the hardest area in travel. So I hope this really helped people understand why that is and what they may be getting themselves into if they go down this road. For more questions or to debate this, I think the best thing is tag me on LinkedIn. There's existing posts and discussions, or start a new post, and I will be happy to reply there. And I think Gilad would as well. So good luck to all the travel entrepreneurs out there. Thanks for attending. See you soon.